Law number 17, the law of priorities. The law of priorities says that leaders understand that activity is not necessarily accomplishment. In other words, the law of priorities says it's not how hard you work, it's how smart you work. The law of priorities says that we either have to evaluate or we're going to stalemate. We have to evaluate what we're going to do or we're going to get stagnant. The law of priorities says that we either going to organize and get our priorities right or we're going to agonize. This is a great law, and I'm going to teach it to you. And of course, if you really want to understand the law, the resource that you want to get there, obviously, is the video, 2-hour video with a 20-page workbook on priorities. I have a whole kit, 2 hours of teaching that is life-changing in helping you understand priorities. But let me for a few minutes teach this law the best that I possibly can. I also explain this law in detail, not only in Priorities, A Pathway to Success, but in my book, Developing the Leader Within You. I have a whole chapter on priorities that will really help you work your way through how to prioritize. But let me break it down for you for a moment, and there's a visual in your notes that'll help you. Pareto says this, that if you get your priorities right on the left-hand column, until number 1 is truly number 1, 2, right on down to number 10 is the least important of the 10. He says, if you do just the top 2, in other words, 20% of what you probably need to do, look across to the next line on production. What he says is you're going to get an 80% return if you just do the top 2 things. And then you can also look and see that if you don't do the top 2, but you do the bottom 8, you're only going to get a 20% return. In fact, this is visual. Just look at this for a moment. If you do the bottom 8 things, you work 4 times harder and you only get a fourth of the return. If you do the top 2 things, you only work a fourth as hard and you get a return that is 4 times. Now, this is a very visual example that says that your job and my job as a leader is to prioritize. You got to prioritize your life. You got to prioritize your programs. You got to prioritize the ministries in your church. You got to prioritize the people in your church. Leaders prioritize. Here's the difference between a leader and a follower. A follower starts out and hopes everything will come out okay. But a leader rises early, thinks through the day, evaluates what's going to happen, and prioritizes his or her life. This morning at 5:20, I'm up in my room, spending time in prayer, looking at these lessons, slowly working through the day so that I can do the best that I can do to give you the laws the best way that I can give you to help them to you. And I ask myself the questions, and I look at the lessons, and I look at the material, and how can I teach it better, and what can I do that will make a difference? And I start my day prioritizing what I need to be doing. Remember, I shared with you in the law of process, I shared with you that the secret of your success is found in your daily routine. Can I tell you something? If I spent the 12 hours with you, one of the things I would find out in 12 hours is how well you prioritize your life. And I want to tell you this, the way you prioritize your life will determine the level of your success. Now, get the picture of a leader. You see, a leader is a steward or a manager of all of the gifts, all of the abilities, all of the opportunities that will be given a congregation. So that leader has to prioritize the people, has to prioritize the opportunities, has to prioritize the giftedness in the congregation. He or she has to continually evaluate, think through, and say, okay, this is number 1. I got to do this first. Then I have to do this next. Now I'm going to walk you through that in a moment. But before I walk you through that in a moment, let's go back to your calendar for a second. If I went home with you and I saw your calendar, would I see a person that fills their calendar on priorities? And let's back up in front of the calendar for a moment. Do you know what your priorities are? And if you know what your priorities are, Do you fill the calendar with the things that you should be doing, or do you let people fill your calendar? You see, can I tell you something? If you let people fill your calendar, you're not working on your priorities, you're working on theirs. Now, I'm not trying to be nasty, but leaders don't let people set their agenda. The general of an army doesn't come out to the army about 7:30 in the morning and go through the barracks and say, gang, does anybody have some suggestions today? What do you think? Do you think we ought to attack, or do you think we ought to wait a while? How many, does anybody have an idea? Anybody got, no, can I tell you something? In the war room, the leaders have already figured out the strategy. They don't go out to the privates and ask them if they have a thought for the day. Their responsibility is to have a plan. Their responsibility is to prioritize. Their responsibility is to lead. That's what their job is. So when they go out, they've got a plan. They say, here's what we're going to do. Let's get our forces ready. Let's get our resources ready. Let's get geared up. This is where we're going. Let's go. Now that's what you and I need to do in the priority issues. We have to prioritize our life, and here's why. A leader that cannot prioritize his or her life cannot prioritize the life of their organization. A confused, untidy leader will have a confused, untidy congregation. That's a fact. The Word of God says if you can't govern yourself, you can't govern anyone else. The first job of leadership isn't to lead others. The first job of leadership is to lead yourself. The first job of prioritizing isn't to prioritize my people, it's to prioritize myself. So we start with you. Do you know what your priorities are? If I could walk out and sit down beside you, and if you and I could have a conversation, and if I ask you, how do you prioritize your life? Talk to me about what you're doing. Would you be able to tell me? Now this graph that you have in your notes, it's taken from the 2080 principle. And basically, Pareto, who teaches this principle, or who taught me this principle through his works, Pareto basically says that if you prioritize correctly, if you do the first two things, 20%, it'll give you an 80% return. And the 2080 principle works throughout your church. Trust me on this. It works throughout your business. Here's the way it works. 20% of your people in your organization will take up 80% of your time. Isn't that true? Don't you have some people in your church and they just, have you got some time, Pastor? Well, yeah, I do. Do you have a day, a week, a month, a year? 20% of the people take up 80% of your time. Trust you, and I can tell you almost always it's the wrong 20%. Your top people, they don't want to take up your time. You know why? Because they don't have any time to take up. They're busy. They got a life. Nothing bugs me more than a person who doesn't have a life trying to steal mine. Have you got all day? No, I don't. Thank you very much. 20% of the people take up 80% of your time. 20% of the people in your organization will do 80% of your work. 20% of the people in your organization will give you 80% of your profit. 20% of your customers will give you 80% of your profit. I mean, the 20-80 principle, it works in every. 20% of the people in your church will give you 80% of your money. The 20-80 principle, nah, this is kind of bad, but it even works for pastors. 20% of your sermon will give you 80% of your results. If you preach for 30 minutes, you got about 6 good minutes. And your people wish to God you could find it. 20% of a book will give you 80% of the material. If you read the front of the book, the back of the book, the major headlines of the book, you got it. Now, that isn't always true. For example, my books, for example, that is... Hey, listen, in church, even when you have dinner on the ground, 20% of the people will eat 80% of the food. Now you got to learn these priorities. You got to understand how to prioritize. So let me give you the 3 priority questions. The 3 priority questions, and they all start with the letter R. The first one is requirement. What's required of me? The second one is return. What gives me the greatest return? And the third is reward. What gives me the greatest reward? You have to ask the requirement question, because to not do that is to get fired. You have to ask the return question, because to not do that, you should be fired. You have to ask the reward question, because if you don't enjoy what you're doing, you'll quit. That's why you got to ask those questions. What's required of me? What gives me the greatest return? What gives me the greatest reward? The moment I ask those questions, that's huge. Now, when I moved from San Diego to Atlanta, I had to really go through my priorities again. By the way, the reason I moved from San Diego to Atlanta was a priority issue. Because you see, living in San Diego, because I have to fly so much, I was spending too much time in the air going from San Diego to Dallas or San Diego to Chicago, only to change planes to go to where I really wanted to go. In fact, Linda, my assistant, figured it out. I asked her, I said, how many days in 1996 did I spend going from San Diego to Dallas and back, or San Diego to Chicago and back, only going to those 2 places to really go to where I needed to go? When she came back, I think she said it was 26 or 27 days I spent in the air. I said, that's not good time management. Got to prioritize my life. It's too much time in the air. So I said, I got to get to a city where I can get quicker to America. And so I looked at Dallas, I looked at Chicago, and I looked at Atlanta, because you see, those cities you can get there quick. In fact, from Atlanta, 80% of all America you can get to within 2 hours of the airport. And 96% of all flights are direct. Whoa. So we went to Atlanta. It was a priority issue. And when I went to Atlanta, knowing that I was going to want to develop this Enjoy group to a whole new level, I said, okay, John, what are you going to do with your time? What are your 4 priorities? And so I worked for 6 months on these 4 priorities. They're going to seem real simple to you, but for 6 months, I, with integrity, said, this is where I got to spend my time. And after I looked at the priorities and worked them through, then I got with my key people. I said, is this true? Is this where I ought to spend my time? Now I'm going to give you my 4 priorities. They're not going to be yours, but that's okay. What you need to do is you need to figure out what your priorities are. But I'll walk you through the process just so that it helps you. Number 1 is leadership. Now that's a priority for me. So I have to spend X amount of time, especially leading the Enjoy group. Means I ought to sit down with the presidents of my organizations and make sure we're on track. And I just have to do a lot of leadership training, development of my own people. Why would I go out and train you how to lead if I don't train my own people how to lead? By the way, it makes a very exciting organization. All of the people in our company are on a personal growth plan. Think what would happen in your organization if the secretary and the custodian and the staff member were all on a personal development growth plan. Leadership. The second priority I have is communicating. I've got to communicate. In other words, I've got to sit down and I've got to teach. That's what I'm doing today. When Linda blocked my calendar, because she runs my calendar, when she blocked my calendar, she literally has X amount of days that we set aside for communicating. If you would look at our next year's schedule, one of the things you would find is we have literally taken these 4 priorities and we have literally assigned days to all 4 of these things. I have X amount of days to lead. I have X amount of days to communicate. So that means I can only be in so many places during a year, and I can only do so many conferences, and I can only give so many days to do what I'm doing right now. I love to do it, but there's only X amount of days I can do. I've got to prioritize my life. The third area that I have to prioritize, the third priority for me is in the creating, writing, thinking field. I've got to think, I've got to create, I've got to write. I've got to develop lessons, I've got to write books. I've got Charlie to walk beside me and all this stuff, but I've got to constantly keep my mind. I constantly got to think. I got to keep asking myself, how can I get this accomplished? I've got to block out X amount of days to write lessons to teach leadership. You know, when I do those Enjoy Life clubs, those maximum impact tapes, I want to tell you something. That takes a lot of work. It takes about 20 hours of work to do a 1-hour lesson. Every time you get an Enjoy Life Club tape, every time you get a Maximum Impact, people say, man, where do you get your stuff? Well, you got to work hard. You got to do research. You got to think. I mean, it takes a long time to get that baby ready. It's okay because it goes out to thousands of people, so it's worth it. But I have to prioritize my time for creating, thinking, writing, that whole section there. And the fourth area is relationships, networking. I've got to spend X amount of days just talking to people, listening to people. In a couple of weeks, I'll spend 2 days just with about 50 pastors, just listening to them, play a little golf, talk to them, try to find out where they are, what are they feeling, what are they thinking, what are they sensing, what are their needs. Now, what I'm saying to you is you've got to go back and you have to prioritize. Now, most of the time, I run through the questions a little faster than I'm going to run through the questions here. There are 2 of them. The first question is, what are my top 20% priorities? And the second question is, who are my top 20% people? I want to give you an assignment. This is going to take a while. You can't do this today, but I want to give you an assignment. This is another place in your workbook where you put a star or I don't know, whatever you do to take, this is where you fold the page down so you make sure you don't lose this. I want you in the next week to do something that's going to take a few hours. You're not going to be able to do this quickly. In fact, if I probably could really schedule you, I'd ask you to set aside a whole day to do this, because this is going to make you or break you in this law of priorities. I would encourage you to sit down, like I shared with you my top 4 priorities. And by the way, let me stop here for a moment. I don't do anything else. You say, John, what do you mean you don't do anything else? I don't do anything else. Just those 4. Now, one of the reasons it's easy for me to do that is there aren't a lot of things I can do. So you got to understand, I'm not one of these versatile people, these jack of all trades. Some people, they can just do everything. I'm not one of those kind of people. You follow me? I have a hard time turning the lights on, okay? You have to understand, I'm very worthless in most areas of my life, which is what has allowed me to be successful. See, if I was good, smart, like most people, could do a lot of things, I'd be in deep weeds. By the way, Paul understood priorities. Paul said, this one thing I do, not these 40 things I dabble in. So Paul and me were quite worthless in a lot of areas. But what you want to do is you want to sit down and you want to ask yourself, okay, what are the things that I need to be doing? And here's how you figure this out. You ask what is it that I have to do that nobody else can do except me? That's huge. What is it that I have to do that nobody else can do except me? Now, when you get that list, whatever that is, here's what I know. That's what you ought to be doing. In other words, if you can train somebody else to do it, then you see, it may be very legitimate that you do it for a period of time if you're training someone else to do it. But if you're not training someone else to do it, and you're going to keep on doing this year in and year out, after a while you got to say, okay, what is it that I have to do that nobody else can do except me? Now, when I was a senior pastor, I reduced it down to only 4 things there, so that I only did 4 things there. And when I deal with senior pastors, what are they doing? They're doing the bulletin. They're doing the bulletin. Come on, folks, the bulletin. Is that what you're giving your life for? The bulletin? When I went to Skyline, they expected me to do the bulletin. They set me in and said, here, you'll want to give Mondays want to give Mondays up for the newsletter that goes out to the people, and you want to give Fridays up for the bulletin. I said, I'm not giving either one of those days up for either, and I don't even care if we don't even have them. Who cares? Now, this is a thought that maybe has never entered your mind, but you can go to heaven without a bulletin. You could have a church service without a bulletin. Now, God may not know when to come in, but that's another issue. They wanted me to do the bulletin. I don't do bulletins. Do I think bulletins are bad? No, but they're bad if I do them. I quit clipping and pasting when I was in kindergarten. Here's what I believe about priorities. I believe we do a lot of things in our organization, not because they're the most important, but because either that's what we like to do, or at least that keeps us busy so we don't have to do the things that we should do. Came home on that one, didn't I? Now, you've got to go through the questions and list your top 20% priorities, and then you got to go through and you got to list your top 20 people. And the reason you need to get your top 20% of the people is because these are the ones that will carry you home. The law of priorities, it's a great law. Here's what I know. If you live it, it'll make your life. Now what I want you to do, if you will, I want you to do me a real favor, and I know I'm asking a big-time favor because I've taught all morning. But I'm going to ask you to stay with me for 10 more minutes. Not because I'm going to teach out of this, but I got to talk to you. And I think now's a good time to talk to you, and here's why. Yeah, you won't need notes here. You won't need a notebook. For yesterday and for today, I've been running around and I've been teaching you all kind of laws, and I get always a little bit nervous because I'm afraid that you think that I'm better than I am, and I know who I am, and I know that I'm not. But I do know leadership. It's because I've been doing this for over 20 years. So when it comes to leadership, I've got answers. And when it comes to the law of priorities, which I just gave you, man, I'm telling you, I know how to prioritize my life. But let me stop here for some integrity and honesty for a moment. I didn't know how to do this law in the beginning. When I went to my first church in Hillham, I knew nothing about priorities. In fact, if you could have been with me in Hillham, if you could have spent a day with me in Hillham, if you could have spent the 12 hours with me in Hillham, can I tell you what you'd have found? You'd have found a kid that was doing all the things he shouldn't be doing and not doing the things that I should be doing. In fact, you'd have walked away from me at the end of my 12-hour days, and I'll tell you what you'd have said about Maxwell. You'd have said, the guy's never going to make it. That's a fact. And I can't teach you leadership without having an integrity with you. Because you see, when you listen to teachers like me that are quick and sharp and got their notes, and I know where I'm going. Folks, I'm sorry, but I'm a very good leader and I know where I'm going. And you listen to me, there's this tendency where you say, I'm never going to be able to be where he is. I'm never going to be able to get on that level. I'm never going to be able to reach that. And I'm here to tell you, if you knew where I came from, you would be greatly encouraged. Because I didn't have these answers. And when I went to the first church, I didn't do most important things. I've already told you I didn't develop anybody, I didn't disciple anybody, I didn't equip anybody, I didn't train anybody. Worse than all of that, when I went to Hillham, I didn't even lead anybody to Jesus the first year. All I did is try to make people happy. All I tried is to get people to like me. You talk about codependent. Mr. Party Boy just wanted everybody to come around and say, you're doing a great job and we like you well. And so my goal wasn't to get anybody saved. My goal wasn't to develop anybody. My goal was to kind of have a group of people that just like me and I like them. We could be kind of one happy family in Hillham, Indiana. But one day, my earth came crashing down. Because one day I was asked to do something that I didn't know how to do. You see, I had a fellow in my church who asked me to go visit a friend, which I went to the hospitals, I visited friends, and so I went and visited this guy, and I saw this guy. I saw this guy periodically for about 3 weeks. We talked about sports. We talked about all kinds of things. We talked about everything but what we should. You talk about a pastor with his priorities all screwed up. I talked to Jim about everything but the main thing. Oh, I would pray a little prayer. I know those little prayer deals that you kind of at the end say, well, here, let me pray with you. And you hold him by the hand and, oh, God bless Jim, blah, 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 and amen, and you're done. I did that stuff. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the fact the man didn't know Jesus. He was lost. I never led him to the Lord. Never talked to him about Jesus. I just went in there and talked about the Cincinnati Reds and had my conversation, did my little pastoral prayer. And I just went around, and about 3 or 4 weeks, one day, I saw him, and I made my other rounds in the Orange County Hospital, and little did I know, but in a few minutes after I left him, all of a sudden he died. And I got home a few hours later, and Margaret was on the phone. She said, honey, she said, Jim died. I said, you're kidding. I just saw him this morning. Well, he died. Wow. Sisters want to know, will you do the funeral? Well, of course I'll do the funeral. Isn't that what pastors do? Don't pastors do funerals? 2 days later, went down to Brosmer Drabean Funeral Home. He only had 2 sisters, the only surviving relatives, and I went up and I hugged him, and how you doing, and God bless you, and did all that pastor palaver stuff. And then, because it was the custom down there in southern Indiana, I took him to the casket to view the body, first time, and they opened the casket, and there their brother was, and they were crying, and I looked down at him, and all of a sudden, it hits me. The guy's lost. And I did nothing. For the first time in my life, God convicted me of my priorities. And I began to cry. Now, the moment I began to cry, these 2 girls, these 2 sisters, they were so touched. They thought I had a heart for Jim. I didn't have a heart for Jim. I was a convicted sinner, realizing that their brother went to hell because I didn't have my life straightened up. I cried, went home, had the funeral next day, cried throughout the sermon, cried as we went to the burial plot, put him in the ground, cried all the way home. Went home and looked at Margaret and said, my life's a mess, Margaret. My life is all screwed up. And I don't know what I'm going to do about this. But what I know is I've got to get a grip. Happened to be Wednesday night. I said, you got to call and have somebody else do the Bible study. I'm not going to church. I can't go to church. Got to fix this. Oh, my friends. What do I say? What do I say? I wish that I could tell you I got that problem fixed that night, but I didn't. I went through 6 months. And it wasn't very easy for me because I had a whole bunch of junk in my life. And you know how it is when you have stuff. You get one fixed and you got something else. And it just took a long time. In fact, I became so discouraged in the process that I talked to Margaret and I said, I don't know if I can hang in the ministry. I don't know if this is who I am. And I told her, I know one thing, if I'm going to stay in the ministry, I'm really going to get the priorities straightened up, because if I can't do this right, I'm not going to do this at all. Oh, I had to deal with pride issues. You wouldn't recognize me. I was a politician. I was one of these lousy, slinky, low-down pastor politicians who I was always looking for a better church and talking to the right people, and, well, do you think it's going to come open, and do you think I'd have a chance, and can you put a good word in for me? It still hurts to think about it. And I'm not one to teach experience. That isn't why I'm here. I'll tell you what, for me, one evening on the floor underneath the dining room table, I had one of those God meetings. And I settled the issues, and God really came that night for me. He really came. And when I settled the issues in my life, I immediately felt that I needed to I felt that with integrity I needed to go to my small little congregation in Hillham and let them know what God had done in my life. So I did. I stood before them the next Sunday morning and I said, "You don't know me. And let me tell you who I really am." And I took off the mask. That's the day I quit having a preacher's voice, and that's the day when all that stuff came off. When I finished apologizing to them and asking their forgiveness, I said, "If it's okay with you, I have to go to my own altar. I need to go down and I need to publicly nail this." And I said, "If you want to pray for me, you can come around and pray for me." And I went down to my own altar, and the people, these farmers, you got to understand, but this time they loved me. They came all around me, and I could hear them coming, and I'm kneeling at the altar. And I still remember Ruth Condra. She was elderly. She was probably in her young 80s, but I mean, she was elderly. She had arthritis. She couldn't even kneel beside me, so she stood beside me. I can still feel her hand on my head as I'm kneeling at the altar, and she's standing beside me. Her husband's Harvey and Ruth Condra, and she's got her hand on me, and she's praying. I'll never forget her words. She said, "Dear God, this is what Harvey and I have been praying for." That's when I realized I hadn't fooled those people. They knew. I got up and hugged those people. I said, "My priorities are right now. I'm going to be a different person." I looked at Phyllis Harrison. Phyllis Harrison lived in that valley all those years. She wasn't a Christian. They'd always have a revival and hope she'd get saved at a revival. And every revival, they'd say, "Maybe this will be the revival Phyllis gets saved." I look at Phyllis and I said, "Phyllis, I'm going to come and see you tomorrow." She said, she had tears. She said, I know. I went up to see her and I said, "Phyllis, people have prayed for you for years in this valley to get saved, and I've never talked to you about Jesus, and you need to get saved. And I've got my priorities right, and I've let one guy slip through, but I'm not going to let anybody else slip through." And I said, "I don't even know how to do this, but I just said, you need to get saved, and I'm here to tell you you need to get saved. I don't even know how to tell you how to get saved, but you need to get saved. And so I'm just going to stay here until you get saved." And for the next couple hours, I looked at her and she looked at me, and all of a sudden, this is the moment, folks. All of a sudden, I saw God do something in her life. And pretty soon, the tears began to flow, and I saw God really begin to tangibly work in her life. And for the first time in my life, as a Christian, I began to see what you might want to call an anointing, or I began to see what you would call the Holy Spirit working. For the first time in my life, all of a sudden I realized that I had finally got into a place where God is going to begin to bless my ministry. And I saw her, she began to weep, and she got on her knees and she prayed, and I prayed with her, and she was beautifully saved. And when it was done, we got up, she hugged me, and I hugged her, and I said, "Oh, Phyllis, this is so good. I never led anybody to Jesus before." I can still remember. God's allowed me to lead thousands of people to Jesus, but there's nothing like the first person you led to Jesus. I said, "Now, Phyllis, I've never had anybody, when I got done preaching, walk the aisle. Never had." I said, "Don't tell anybody what happened. I'll get up Sunday and I'll preach and I'll give the invitation, and you can walk the aisle, and you can be the first person, and everybody will rejoice and be excited because they prayed for you for years." And she said, "Okay." I said, "We'll keep it a secret." About 6 o'clock that afternoon, I'm having dinner with Margaret, and the phone rings, and it's Phyllis. She's cried. She's an old preacher. She said, "I messed up." I said, what happened? She said, well, my husband, John Henry, came home and he took one look at me and said, what happened to you? She said, I couldn't help myself. She said, I told him that I got saved. And then she said, he's sitting on the couch and he's crying and he'd like to get saved. And I know it's your dinner hour. But if you could come back over, she said, I think he's ready too. And I got in my little Volkswagen and drove back over, and there he was sitting with his son Tim and Danny, and all three of them were crying. And that night I led all three of them to Jesus. By the way, Danny, his oldest son, is now a very successful pastor in the ministry. And I was so excited, and I went home and I told Margaret, I said, look what's happening in my ministry now that I got the stuff taken out of it. The next Sunday morning I preached, and folks, that day when I preached, it was totally different. For the first time, I knew what it was like to preach with a covering and an anointing in my life. For the first time, I knew that my people knew that I had spent time with God. When I gave the invitation, 17 people came forward. And that morning marked my life. It marked my ministry. And I just tell you that, not because I want to tell you experience. I tell you that because I want to give you hope. I want to give you hope, Pastor. Listen to me, layperson. I want to give you hope. You say, well, my life isn't clicking like it needs to click, and I'm not leading like I need to lead. Listen to me. If God could do this for me, he can do this for you. So when I got up this morning, and I looked at these laws that I have to teach you, and I'm giving it my best shot, but I know that we're doing it quick, and I'm wanting you to grab them, and I'm saying, oh God, how are they going to get all the laws? How are they going to get all the laws under the belt? How can I help them really go to another level? And then all of a sudden I realized I've got to do my best, but what really makes this conference the conference it can be is not what I can do or not what you can do, but what God could do.